Tommy and Ellen. Okay, recording is on. So, Dan, I know you like to give sometimes an opening remark for your group since it's going to be recorded. You can go ahead and do that if you want to.
No, I'll leave it all up to Rami. Go ahead, Rami.
I'm going to go ahead first. Rami and I have agreed.
All right, Ellen.
Girls go first, right, Rami?
I'm going to go ahead and mute myself. Then go ahead, Ellen.
Ladies first. I don't know. Okay, I just wanted to make a few comments at the outset. Okay, I'm very, very excited about what we're talking about this morning for a couple of reasons. One is that, we're getting a little bit off the Western track. And, there's a big wide world out there, and we tend to focus on the West almost exclusively. And it's good that we're branching out. It's to the unfamiliar. And to many, it's not as interesting, or it's a little frightening, or, or challenging. And all the more reason, I think, for us to do this. And I love it. And it's Rami who got us there. Another comment is that we've been talking about critical thinking and consciousness and travel. And here's this great thinker we're talking about who had to get outside of himself and take a long, long trip from Baghdad to Jerusalem, all across the Middle East, and he had to do it because he was trying to get out of his conventional self. And I just love that. And finally, I would want to say that as a university professor who left to abandon the life of thought in order to cope with the absurd reality of a bunch of professors, hundreds of them, all knowing they were right, and having to listen, observe, and keep her mouth shut. It's real hard for me to do that. I just recognize, I identify with Ghazali's intellectual journey and his struggle reconciling faith and reason. Because whether we admit it or not, just about everybody who's brilliant, whom we know, is involved in that struggle. It never stops. It never stops. And I'd love to challenge anyone who thinks it stops. Okay. So thank you, Rami, for giving me an opportunity to reread Ghazali and think about what we've been thinking about today. It's been fun to work with Rami, even though, we find our differences.
Yes, thank you, Ellen.
Yeah.
Dan, I'm sorry for not popping in a few minutes sooner. May I screen share some slides, please?
Okay, I'm setting that up now.
While he's doing that, Ellen, would you introduce yourself? Because some people don't know who you are. And Rami, do the same.
Thank you, Steve. Well, I am a devotee of this group. I have been enjoying it for 10 years now, and primarily thanks to Mikey, who introduced me to it. And I love this group because it's composed of a array of people with a range of backgrounds who are all seeking enlightenment and love to argue with one another and challenge whatever the status quo is. I myself am a Russian historian, Byzantine historian who has lived and worked overseas, and indeed has been university president, college president for about 20 years, and humbled by that activity, and who just loves learning and getting outside of my traditional background. Love the classics, and here I am. Thanks to Rami, I'm sharing this dialogue.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you all. So we've had some fun back and forth with Ghazali, but I think it's all in service to this question: what gets us to the good end? There's a lot that could be said, and I'm going to ignore about 98% of it. Just a little bit of background in terms of who our topic for this morning is. The man was a 11th and 12th century Sunni scholar who made Shia, and I emphasize the fact that Shia was an extension, or rather that Sufism, the Sufi mystics were a branch out of the Shia, which is kind of important because to note, because it would have been possible that that Sufism would have been wiped out, just treated like a Islamic cult, and then like with so many other groups, would have been disappeared before we ever even got to hear about this. And one very significant thing that that Al-Ghazali did was that he made it all right. He expanded the faith in such a way so as to make it acceptable for this child of the Shia branch of Islam to be all right with the Sunnis, and that, it may sound like nothing at all, but it made all the difference in terms of how would we else know, and also not only for Islams, be they Sunni or Shia, but for anyone around the world, they now have this example of another sort of way of being in belief community with one another, wherein the for lack of a better term, Almighty is present. So this is a guy who started in Tus, then he moved to Georgian. He went to the next city there in Persia, and he studied under specific people who the Swedish fellow in the first video resource is actually probably a lot better and give you a background to for the names and how to pronounce them specifically. But the important thing to know about him, something that you can pull out of his method in terms of the man, is something that you can apply, not just in a religious domain, but just in your everyday rational going about life. And that is, he would take whatever the topic was, and then he would try to extrapolate it out into the future and into the branches of the future in order to determine what would be the natural end of that. And then paired with that process, he would also trace back up through all of the axioms that originated the idea to begin with. So this is a man who explored not just future possibilities, but did historical deep dive in order to figure out, well, where's this coming from? What were, down to the very even binary ideas, the decisions that resulted in this belief that we're now facing, and that was his process for determining true from not true. Okay, so that was a lot of his work. The incoherence of the philosophers is it's a set of 20 refutations, 3 of which are so important, but at the same time so abstract that that it really doesn't have anything to do with practice. It rather has to do with fundamental, and I'm going to say decisions more than belief, because I don't know exactly how decisions are always made. However, what was happening, because starting in the 8th century, there was an influx of translations of the Greeks, and people were reading the Greeks, and people were making their own philosophies like the Greeks. And he was part of them, actually. He grew up in that world. From Tus to Georgian to Neyshabur, where he came across his probably greatest mentor, whose impartation stuck with him for the rest of his life. If he's not addressing it in the incoherence of the philosophers in terms of what the Greeks, what Aristotle, for instance, had to say, then he really doesn't have a problem with that. In fact, when it came to the Aristotelian ethics or the tradition, like we have a legal tradition here in the United States, but when something isn't addressed within our own body of law, we fall back to British common law and Blackstone, and it goes back for hundreds and hundreds of years. Same case in his situation, the time and place that he lives, only what they were falling back on was the law of Hammurabi. Okay, that was the tradition of the area, the law of the land. However, he thought that the ethics of Aristotle and his school was actually superior. So in this way, it's sort of like when the Dalai Lama, when the Dalai Lama was asked, well, what do you do when you find a conflict between science and religion? And the Dalai Lama said, well, you change the religion. Okay, so deliverance from error was something I'm hoping that through her reading and research, Ellen will be able to share more about. The revival of the religious sciences, third major work, and he did like 40 at least, but these are highlights, is actually a work that came out of his journal from his 11-year period from about his crisis in the mid 1090s and until the middle of the 1100s. And in a way, it's sort of like it was a work. Imagine if Marcus Aurelius took Meditations and didn't just write it for himself, but wrote it for his entire community. It's sort of, when we see these two words together, religious and sciences, that might, to our Western ears, sound something like an oxymoron, but actually within Asia, especially in places like India, you'll find that, and this is a place he's coming from between the Middle East and India. Religious sciences is actually something that had been developed for beyond centuries, probably by his time, even a millennia and a half, if not longer, maybe 2.5 millennia. So finally, to just conclude on his background, he's actually the second most read Muslim after Muhammad. So there's no denying the significance, not only of his process, but his contributions. Not to say that he's alone, because there are plenty of others, but certainly a lot of people say, oh, well, you can't really talk about Islam without talking about Ghazali, and you can't ignore, as Helen has brought to my attention. I hope I'm not stealing any of your material, Ellen, but she's made it a point to state that what he wrote went on to influence figures such as Descartes and David Hume. So I mentioned crisis. This was a guy who was learned from a young age and was a master at rhetoric. And he, as I've stated when I mentioned his methodology, he could in very many cases just sort of run circles around people. I'm sorry, but that was the case. And he did this for a long time, and he would claim his specialty was systematic theology, like he could give you every rational argument for God that was in existence at that time. However, and he was actually on his way to teaching a class, and he goes into the class and he finds that he can't talk. And because he's been having doubts for about 2 years, he's been studying his younger brother, who was getting into Sufism actually for a while. And he was starting to research it and to study it, because that's what you do. And he found that before his class, he just couldn't say a word. So the reason why he couldn't say a word, it's what was it that kept him? It was, he'd come to realize it wasn't faith that was driving his work anymore. It was actually his ego. And keep in mind that this is a culture which very much does believe in the afterlife, because That's just what most people have done throughout this period of time in this place. And the whole goal of your life is basically to have a good end. Okay. And if all you're doing is basing your work upon or basing your judgment upon yourself, that can be shaky ground, because we all know that to err is human. Okay. So this led to about a 2-month period where he had a loss of his faith, he had a loss of certainty in himself, certainty in what he believed, certainty in everything. And then in that first introductory video resource, it's fairly well described. You can go back and watch this after. What happened is that he had a presence that lit up him from his center, and basically let him know that it was going to be all right. Okay, I don't know that presence ever even had to speak a word to Ghazali, but it changed him, and he went off into his journey. He made sure that his family, because he had wife and kids and all these possessions, of course, and he gave it up. And he just started walking. Ellen wants to make sure that this quote from Ghazali, of course it's English translation, made it into the presentation. I'm just going to read it. I learned with certainty that it is above all the mystics who walk on the road of God. Their life is the best life, their method the soundest method, their character the purest character. Indeed, where the intellect of the intellectuals and the learning of the learned and the scholarship of the scholars, who are all versed in the profundities of revealed truth, brought together in an attempt to improve the life and character of the mystics, they would find no way of doing so. For to the mystics, all movement and all rest, whether external or internal, brings an illumination from the light of the lamp of prophetic revelation. And behind the light of prophetic revelation, there is no other light on the face of the earth from which illumination may be received. So that's our introduction to Al-Ghazali. I guess we can open it up unless Ellen has something more to say.
I certainly do, Rami. A little bit more before we open it up. You know, Al-Ghazali was fun to read for me, because I'm not sure how many of you read and how much, and I'm very curious about that. I really am, because I always think in our sessions on Sunday, how much reading should we assign and how much should we assume in our discussion? And I'd love to return to that. But Al-Ghazali is such fun because he really is confessional about himself. His own journey is really his exploration of the meaning of life and how he fits into it. And when you read him, you don't just get involved in his challenge of particular philosophies. You get involved in his sort of psychological, if you will, thinking of his search for how he is going to cope with the connection between reason and revelation, between the rational and the irrational, and how he should lead his life. How can you stand up in front of a room professing the understanding of Aristotelian forms when you don't really think that Aristotle had it all together? So I juxtapose that in my mind with the fact that this guy, more than just about anyone else, brought Aristotle to the Western world. I mean, it's amazing to me. You know, here's this guy from Persia and from Baghdad who's working with the Caliph in Baghdad and running a university, who takes Western classical thought, Plato, Neoplatonists, Aristotle, and brings them through them, because he's living during the time of the Crusades and things are moving around across the Western, Middle Eastern, Eastern worlds, and really resuscitates Plato and Aristotle for the entire medieval world. I mean, I don't want to overstate it. Some of the stuff came up through the papacy, but mainly it came up through the Islamic scholars. So what we study today is paradoxically the result of other people from other worlds saving it for us in times of turmoil. So I don't know, I could go on and on. I'm deeply, deeply, profoundly fascinated by this, in part because, again, I think all of us in our own way are trying to figure out, the more we live, how the limits, what it means that human understanding has its limits, okay? And how in our own lives and in our own thinking, we want to go beyond it. And some of us get into this trap, and even Ghazali was trying to deal with it, this trap of only thinking along our particular faith lines and backgrounds. And we can't get outside of it. And we don't listen to each other as we struggle with this. And it almost is taboo to talk about it because we get so damned dogmatic about it. So that's what interests me, is how to talk about these things in ways that are empathetic, okay, without being and not hostile, because it's hard, no matter how we talk about it, to deal with this. So I thank Rami for bringing this up. And again, I hope we return to this one way or another in our future discussions. So thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you, Rami, and thank you, Ellen, for the introduction. Rami, if you could go ahead and pull your, there you go. Okay, very good. And I'm going to be the moderator, actually.